In today's interview, I spoke to Gary Vogler, who was a 1973 graduate of West Point. He was also a retired Army Reserve Lieutenant Colonel. He also worked for ExxonMobil for 21 years, including as an executive, crossing over between when it was Mobil and then merged with Exxon, one of the biggest oil companies in the world. If you're in the UK, that's the Esso garage as you see. He then, interestingly enough, in 2003, he gets a job at the Pentagon just after the invasion of Iraq. His job is to be part of the oil planning. He then carries on in Iraq for another 75 months under the direction of the DoD. There was a period of time in between his job at ExxonMobil and then being employed by the US government. So Gary has a really interesting story that's just come out through his book. And, there's many theories about the Iraq War, the motives behind it, what was it all about. On the one hand, you have people talking about the US oil agenda or the UK oil agenda, whoever it may be, normally obviously more the US. And then kind of the Israel lobby, the neocons who surrounded George Bush in that administration were very close to Israel, some of them, writing papers for Netanyahu and just kind of surrounding themselves with kind of a Likud party. And they wanted to remake the Middle East, get rid of Saddam Hussein, and make the region better for Israel. And what Gary does is he brings these two stories together. So at the start of the war, there is public information about this. There's a pipeline from Kirkuk in Iraq that used to go to Haifa in Israel. And this was from kind of the British Mandate of Palestine times that would flow oil from Iraq, which was, carved up during World War One with the French, that was for the British, to Palestine. And then 1948, the King of Iraq stops the oil flowing because Israel is founded. So at the start of the war, there's public information in Haaretz, Israeli media, The Guardian, etc., talking to figures in the administration around about the possibility of getting this pipeline going once they got rid of Saddam Hussein. You had Netanyahu, who was the finance minister at the time, going to London. There's lots of articles discussing this, Israeli figures speaking to the media about wanting to do this. It didn't really end up happening, as Gary explains. He didn't know at the time why all these pipelines were getting blown up and destroyed, normally by some of the people actually linked to who they were working with. But then it started to make sense throughout the years when he did more research for his first book and his second, why this was going on. Then they went on to kind of the plan B, which was getting oil from the Kurds later in the war. The Kurds are in the northern region of Iraq, which was kind of their plan B. He also talks about how after the fall of the Shah in 1979, who was kind of more openly allied with Israel, when the revolution happens and we have, the mullahs who are in now, they carried on selling oil to Israel through one of their pipelines secretly up until the mid-90s through one of these interesting figures who actually went on to kind of found Glencore, etc. It's a really interesting story, one you've probably never heard. I know myself, I hadn't not really heard of that side of the agenda, that Israeli influence, oil, and it's all come together. As I mentioned, there's public information. I'll put it up on the screen in the show notes. You can read these articles yourself. It is kind of not even an open secret because it's open information. It's just never really discussed. It's been forgotten. And even Gary at the time, working within these roles, had no idea it was happening. There was lots of suspicious stuff happening and people within the administration and his team who seemed to be a lot more concerned about Israeli interest than US soldiers or Iraqi citizens. So I hope you can enjoy the interview. Just for a disclaimer, you're going to hear me at the start of this talk about we actually was going to talk about something different because I did have Gary on before, but unfortunately the recording was lost from Skype as it was just before they was transitioning to Teams and it just didn't record, which I was pretty gutted by. So I thought I wouldn't make Gary say it all again. So was going to do something different, but we actually ended up just kind of discussing this anyway. I hope you find it interesting and feel free to look up everything. Enjoy. Welcome to the Truth Over Comfort show. Today's guest is Gary Vogler, who is here today to talk about the Iraq War, his time there. He was an ExxonMobil executive for up to 21 years from when it was Mobil until they merged with Exxon. He then, at the start of the 2003 Iraq War, was part of the oil planning there for about 5 months, and then he continued on for 75 months under the DoD. And it'd be really good to get his perspective on the Iraq War. I actually did have Gary on before, but unfortunately the Skype recording did not record just before their transitional period to Teams, which is a shame, but you can see his interview with Scott Halton, which I massively recommend, where he talks about his recent book, Israel, the winner of the 2003 Iraq Oil War, where he goes into lots of details, which I will let him still discuss briefly here. But I really recommend that interview. It's almost 2 hours long. I'd never heard the story before. Really interesting. People always think Iraq War oil, but they don't really necessarily think Israel as well. But today I thought we could just go into your general kind of time in Iraq, the culture, the people, your initial thoughts on the war, how you saw the country change, how maybe it shaped your worldview after the war, how you perceive some of the conflicts after then, and some of the people you was around, like Paul Wolfowitz and other, like Doug Feith, other neocon names people know. That was a really long intro, Gary, but thanks for coming on again and giving me your time. I really appreciate it. And if you could just let people know about yourself and your recent book and kind of what I alluded to there with the Israeli influence on the energy policy in Iraq.
Okay, thank you, Louis. Yes, as Louis mentioned, I had both an oil background and an Army background. I graduated from West Point in 1973. I was on active duty for 7 years, and then I got out off of active duty and stayed in the Army Reserves. But I spent 21 years in the oil industry with Mobil Oil and ExxonMobil. Continued in the Army Reserve. I eventually retired as a lieutenant colonel. But I left ExxonMobil about 6 or 7 months before I signed up at the Pentagon for what would turn out to be 80 months of assisting the Pentagon, Department of Defense, in the oil sector in Iraq. The 5 months at the Pentagon, followed by 75 months in Iraq. I was the longest serving American in Iraq, and my focus was oil. But I was out there 75 months, oil the full time. My highest rank, I was a contractor for most of the time, but my highest government rank while I was out there was Senior Executive Service 2, which is the equivalent of a 2-star Army general. If I go back to 2003, after we did our planning, we deployed to Iraq. I was the senior oil advisor to a guy by the name of Jay Garner. And Jay was the first civilian leader that went into Iraq. We had several people that were advisors to Jay for various ministries, and I was the senior oil advisor for the Ministry of Oil. When we deployed to Kuwait, just a couple of days before the war kicked off on March the 20th, 2003. And I remember that day quite well because the Jay Garner asked myself, Ambassador Robin Rafale, and retired Lieutenant General Ron Adams to fly down from Kuwait City down to Qatar at the CENTCOM headquarters to link up with them, to open lines of communications with the CENTCOM staff. And I remember we were late in arriving, and as we were rushing into the conference room, there was a 4-star general in there waiting with several other generals and a ton of colonels sitting around. In fact, the 4-star was John Abizaid, who was my West Point classmate. And we went in, and as we were going in, I was looking for the person, Marine Colonel, who I had coordinated with for the previous 6 months, 6 months, Paul Shelton. And as we were getting ready to take our seats, I said, Paul, what's the latest? I haven't heard anything on the oil sector. He said, oh, Gary, things are looking good. He said the 3rd Infantry Division is near Nasiriyah. They made it through the oil fields in the south. And there's only 5 reported oil well fires at the time. When he said that, my mind began to all of a sudden fast forward into the planning, because we had planned for 1,000 oil well fires. We thought for 6 months, all we would be doing was putting out oil well fires, similar to what happened in 1991. When I learned that it was only going to be less than 10, I knew that that would be a week or 2 or 3 week job. And so I needed to be thinking further out into the future as to what our plans were that we had just come up with. And so I was sitting there thinking, my mind was going, when someone said, Gary, and I looked around, and here it was Ron Adams. He said, General Abizaid asked you a question. And so I stood up and I looked around the room, and again, there must have been 50 people in the room. And I said, I'm sorry, but I said, what I just heard was huge. I said, the success of getting through Basra, the oil fields, moving north, I said, you've put the oil sector 9 to 12 months ahead of schedule. I said, that's fantastic. I said, now my job, and as I was saying that, Colonel Paul Shelton, the Marine Colonel, shouted, I said, Gary, I didn't tell you the bad news. And I said, what was the bad news, Paul? And he said, well, we lost a CH-46 full of Marines that were headed out to the offshore oil platform. All 20 on board died. But when he said that, I just felt like someone kicked me in the gut. And I sat down and I looked at General Abizaid, and I said, I'm sorry, what was your question? But that's the way things went. You take 2 or 3 steps forward, and then something would happen. There would be a disaster or an attack or something for the following 3 or 4 years to set you back, to make you realize that this was a real war that was going on, and there were costs involved in this war. So that was my kickoff. That was my day one of the war. Then we went back to Kuwait. We continued to plan and move into the south. In April, several of us moved into Baghdad. Several civilians moved into Baghdad. I was the first American civilian to enter the Ministry of Oil at the end of April. And in fact, as I state in my books, I was actually the Minister of Oil for my first 10 days in Baghdad. And then until I appointed a gentleman by the name of Thamar Gadban, a very capable oil leader who took over for the following several months and helped us as we experienced some huge successes the first 3 or 4 months. And that consisted of, we were able to get oil production back in middle of April. Again, that was 6 to 9, 12 months ahead of schedule. We were exporting oil again in June. We had made plans to rebuild the oil sector from what was damaged during the war. And we were planning on getting all that done in less than a year. And myself and the rest of the oil people were planning on being out of there by the end of 2003 or early 2004. And so it all looked good. It all went according to plan until July of 2003. And that's when things started to deteriorate. I can remember it well because I was in the office in Baghdad late at night, and I got a call from Mr. Gadban, at the oil ministry, and he said, Gary, we got a serious problem. And I said, what is it? He said, well, we've had two attacks on two different pipelines that supply crude oil to the Baghdad refinery. And he said, this is different than the other attacks. He said, the other attacks, people, they tried to get to tap into the pipelines to steal the oil for fuel or to sell it for economic reasons. He said, in this case, he said, they were just trying to shut us down, to shut down the refinery, to deprive us from making gasoline and diesel and cooking fuel for the population. He said this was a real attack and an insurgency attack. Well, that was that was the beginning, as far as I was concerned. That was the beginning of the insurgency, because yes, it did. It was a very successful attack. It had shut down the Baghdad refinery for more than a week until we could get the thing repaired, and that put us. We were very short gasoline and diesel and cooking fuel, heating oil before that, but that attack really put us behind. And so there were gas lines that formed in Baghdad, several miles long, and all those gas lines contributed to a population that was irritated, increased attacks on U.S. soldiers, resulting in U.S. soldiers getting hurt, getting killed. And I can remember one specific example. One night late, I started getting emails from General David Petraeus up in Mosul. He was commander of the 101st. And he said, Gary, I need for you to give me permission to cut a deal with the Syrians so that we can exchange crude oil up here for gasoline and diesel. And I said, I can't do that, because the neocons back at the Pentagon would have me fired within 24 hours if I gave such an approval, knowing full well that their plan was to continue the fight after Iraq to Syria. And he said, Gary, I need to get access to gasoline. He said, we had a soldier that got out of his vehicle today down in town because the crowds were getting out of hand. So he tried to control the crowds. He said while he was doing that, an Iraqi came up behind him, took a pistol, put it between his helmet and his flak jacket, and blew his brains out. But when I heard that, or when I saw that in writing, my stomach sunk. Again, it was another kick in the gut. Excuse me. So I wrote back to General Petraeus and I said, and I cover this in the book. I said, hey, I can't get you that authority, but we were both plebes at West Point several years ago, and we learned that the authority of a commander is to do what they feel like is necessary to secure the safety of their troops. I said, you've got more authority from that than I can get you. And he said, I got it, Gary. And within a week or so, I heard that he had secured a deal with the Syrians where he would get the local Iraqi Minister of Oil people to ship crude oil to Syria, and in return he'd get gasoline and diesel. And in fact, there was a great article in the New York Times that praising General Petraeus for making such a brilliant decision. But we did get some feedback from the neocons at the Pentagon, the folks that wanted war with Syria. They didn't want a peaceful coexistence with them. In fact, I got a call on the telephone from one of these guys. And first he quizzed me, said, did I give authority? And I said, no, I didn't give authority. And then he said he'd heard that Petraeus did it on his own. I said, well, I don't know who gave the general authority. And he said, if we find out that he did it, if he made the decision, he's going to be one sorry general. And then he hung up on me. So that was part of the pressure that we got at least I saw firsthand when we got into Iraq during that summer of 2003. It was a very, very difficult summer, probably the hardest summer I'd have ever experienced. And But that was the type of pressure we were getting while our troops were out there in 120-degree heat.
Yeah, just for some background there for people. So when you talk about the neocons there, I'm sure pretty much everyone listening knows them, but they're kind of the people around PNAC, the Project for a New American Century. They wrote a letter to Bill Clinton when he was president in the 90s saying these bombings aren't enough and the sanctions, we need full scale, basically, military action. They then sent another letter to George W. Bush as soon as he's pretty much elected. It was people like Paul Wolfowitz, John Bolton, Doug Feith, Richard Pearl, and lots of other kind of architects of the war. And you referred to the pressure around Syria there as that was on their list after Iraq to overthrow. For people to make sense of it now is in 1996, Richard Pearl and forgetting the other person's name, basically wrote a policy paper for Benjamin Netanyahu about basically remaking the Middle East, called A Clean Break. And it was about overthrowing Iraq and Syria as well, so that the weapons Iran was sending to Hezbollah in Lebanon couldn't come through Syria, the land bridge, they call it. And obviously that now actually has been achieved after, from 2011 to now, the attempt to overthrow Assad, who was the president at the time, or dictator at the time of where you're referring to there. And eventually they got what they wanted, and now we have HTS, which is an offshoot of Al Qaeda. So it's funny, these conversations that were happening then have come to fruition, and they finally got rid of Assad, and now we have an Al Qaeda government, which is very, very, very strange considering what happened in 9/11 and the invasion of Afghanistan and beyond. But I appreciate you building the picture at the start of your time in Iraq, things you're dealing with, the pressure of the situation of the war, but also people with certain interests who care more about punishing Syria than helping the situation in Iraq. But if you could just give people kind of the synopsis of what you're referring to here, and the role of kind of Israel. So your most recent, so you've written two books. One was about the politics of oil in the Iraq war. Since then, after doing further research, finding out about articles in Israeli media and beyond, you learned some of the oil agenda is actually more towards Israel and a certain pipeline that they wanted to build, and how that didn't quite happen, but the plan B, etc. If you could, I appreciate you're building your story up, but yeah, if you could give people an idea of that pipeline and Israel's role within that administration, because as I said before, I'd never heard of that at all. So if you could give people an idea of that, that'd be great, Gary.
Yeah, yeah. During the 2003 and for 12 years, I denied that there was an oil agenda to that war. I didn't know that there was. I saw things that looked out of kilter. That didn't seem to be right. Like the people questioning, challenging us. The guy that challenged this was a guy by the name of Michael Mikowski, who was a young junior analyst at the time that was on our team. Today, Michael he's the CEO of JINSA, the Jewish Institute for National Security in downtown DC. I was told back in 2003 by a CIA guy, I had heard about this JINSA organization, and he said, hey, that's just a front for Mossad, Israeli intelligence. Okay, since that time, and a few years ago, I learned that Mike left the United States in 1989 to go to Israel, join the IDF, and then to join the Israeli Foreign Service. When this guy from the CIA told me that, I said, "What's the Israeli Foreign Service?" And he said, "Well, 98% of Israeli Foreign Services, Mossad, Israeli intelligence.
When I look back at what Mike did, because he was the only guy on our team that refused to volunteer to go into Iraq. He stayed back at the Pentagon, and throughout my book, I identify things where he would call up and ask about. In fact, he asked in July of 2003, he called out there. He needed to find out the status of the Kirkuk-Haifa pipeline as he talked to me on the phone, and that was the first I'd ever heard of this pipeline. And I said, look, I know where Kirkuk is, but he was pronouncing it in this Hebrew pronunciation of Haifa. He was calling it Hafu. He said, Gary, he said, find out the status of the Kirkuk to Hafu pipeline. And I said, Mike, I said, look, I said, I know where Kirkuk is, but where's this Hafu that you mentioned? He said, oh, it's out west in the direction of Syria. He was misleading me, okay? And I said, wow. I said, does this have something to do with Wolfowitz talking about hiding WMD in pipelines? And he said, I can't discuss that. We're on a non-secure line. And so I said, okay. I said, let me see what I can find out. So the next day, I was out talking to the guy who was the oil minister at the time, the Iraqi, and I said, hey, can you tell me about a pipeline that goes from Kirkuk to Hafu? And he got I looked at him, and all of a sudden he got very serious, and he was tensing up. And I thought, oh, shoot, he's having a heart attack or something. And he said, Gary, you don't want me to ask that question of my organization. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, he said, there are a lot of people in this country, and certainly a lot of people in the oil ministry, that think the only reason why you guys came in here was to take our oil and ship it to Israel. He said, if I go and ask about an old pipeline that went from Kirkuk to Haifa, he said, we will only be confirming their thoughts on this. And when he said Haifa, I immediately said, oh, shoot, I've been deceived by Mikowski. This is a political question. So I said, don't do a thing on this. I said, let me check with the people and see if I've got the question right. And I went back, and Mike called me, said, okay, what's the status? And I said, Mike, I said, you didn't tell me it was Haifa, Israel. I said, you led me to believe it was Hafu. I said, this is a political hot potato. I said, you put in writing what you want from me and why you want it, and I'll sit down with Ambassador Bremer before I go and get it. And all of a sudden I heard the phone hang up. He went around me. He got the phone number of the oil minister, and we had given cell phones to all the key people, and the oil minister had a cell phone. He was able to get that cell phone, and he called him up after talking to another contact and asked him the question about that pipeline. And well, about 2 weeks after that, the pipelines in Baghdad started blowing up. The oil pipelines that fed the Baghdad refinery blew up.
Okay. And so you say, well, how does a guy who's Mossad or a Mossad asset get appointed to a key position, an oil position at the Pentagon in 2002 to make Middle East oil policy for the war in Iraq? Good question. I started asking that question in 2015 when I was starting to write my first book, Iraq and the Politics of Oil. I knew for a fact that Mike had a hard time getting a top secret clearance because I remember him walking into our SCIF, our secure area at the Pentagon, very angry one day. And I said, what's the matter, Mike? You look angry. And he said, I just came from my third interview with the Pentagon security people, and they refused to give me my top secret clearance. Well, I started laughing. I big smile. And he said, what's so funny? And I said, well, congratulations. I said, you're the first person I've ever met that needed more than one interview to get your top secret clearance. I said, you must have an interesting background. And all he said was that they were interested in his friends in Israel. And then he said, I'm going straight to Doug Feith. He's going to fix this. Well, I learned later that he did. He went to Feith. And so Mike got his top secret clearance the same way that Doug Feith got his top secret clearance back in 1982. A senior person within the administration waived the law, the regulation that would have prevented them from getting a top secret clearance. They got a waiver. But anyway, as I said, I denied the fact that there was an oil agenda from 2003 on. In fact, I was interviewed by most of the reporters that came into Baghdad from the major news media. You won't find my name because I refuse to be interviewed unless they did it strictly on background, so they don't quote me. But with every one of them, they were convinced that there was an oil agenda to that war, and they thought the agenda was to get oil for the major oil companies. And I knew that wasn't true. I had worked for ExxonMobil for a number of years. The ExxonMobil people didn't even know that I was on this team. They didn't find out until they read an article in the Wall Street Journal written by Chip Cummins in March of 2003 that I was even on the team. I started getting emails on my AOL account saying, Gary, what are you doing? Where are you? So that was a total surprise to them. And I didn't know the CEO at ExxonMobil at the time. I'd never met the guy. So that was somewhat amusing. I knew there was no oil agenda, and I denied it for 12 years until I started writing my book. I did some serious research and learned that there was an agenda to open a pipeline, an old pipeline that was constructed in 1934 that ran oil from Kirkuk in the north of Iraq out through what is now Jordan and into the port city of Haifa in Israel. That pipeline was up and operational starting in 1934 and then was shut down by the king of Iraq in 1948 when Israel came into existence. Then the Iraqi Petroleum Company had the sole concession on oil in Iraq. They quickly built a new pipeline that went to Banias, Syria, for their exports. But there was a period of a few years from 1948 to 1952 that there was no, they couldn't export the Kirkuk crude. Then in 1952 and until April of 2003, about 150 to 250 barrels a day were being exported to Banias, Syria from northern Iraq. And it was stopped after Paul Wolfowitz ordered the destruction of the pipeline, and it was destroyed by the 75th Rangers in April of 2003. I had no idea why he ordered that destruction. In fact, generals would come up to me years later in Baghdad and say, Gary, why did Wolfowitz, or why did you guys destroy that pipeline out in Anbar province? And I said, I have no idea. You'd have to ask Paul Wolfowitz that question. Well, it took me 15 years to figure out why he did it. Okay. And it was because of this initial desire to open a pipeline and send oil to Israel. But I didn't read about this until I was looking at archived articles from Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper. It's been the Israeli newspaper since 1917. It's kind of the New York Times of Israel. But in there, they were talking about this plan to reopen the pipeline to Haifa and send Iraqi crude to Haifa. Well, that was all, and there was the plan to do that. Bibi Netanyahu was the Minister of Finance at the time. And there was an article in there where Bibi went to London to not only reopen the pipeline and get it operational, but expand it so that they could start exporting 1 million barrels a day and turn Haifa into, as Ahmed Chalabi said, the Rotterdam of the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, they all got this plan based on this guy, Ahmed Chalabi. And Ahmed Chalabi was the key player, the key Iraqi who made contact with the Israeli government, the Israeli lobby in the U.S., and promised them that if they, and this was the late 1990s, he promised them if they would help him use the U.S. Army to overthrow Saddam and put him in as the first prime minister, that he would reopen this old pipeline and send this oil out to Haifa. Well, it didn't work, didn't happen that way, because I got that call in July of 2003 saying the Iraqis were attacking their own pipelines. Well, we didn't know why they were attacking their own pipelines at the time. We had no clue. We felt like it was an inside job, but we didn't know the reason. And it was years later that I would learn that one of the senior people inside of the ministry came to the U.S. and we had a meeting in town. And the question was asked of him, why do Iraqis attack their own pipelines? And he told the story about that attack in July of 2003. He knew that there were only about a half a dozen people that worked for him that knew where those pipelines were operational and how it would shut down his refinery. So he called him into his office and he said, "Talk to me. Tell me, why are these pipelines being attacked? What's going on here?" And they all kind of looked at the floor and him-hawed back and forth. He said, "Hey, look, we've gone to the same mosque for over 30 years. Talk to me. Make me understand." And the one gentleman pulled out an Arabic newspaper article from Baghdad that was quoting Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, talking about how this pipeline was going to be open from Kirkuk to Haifa. And he said, "Look, the Americans are taking our oil and sending it to Israel." And when he said that, I remembered the whole incident. I looked at him and I said, "You're kidding me." I said, "What did you tell this guy?" And he looked at me and he said, "Gary, I told him that the Americans are not doing that. If they were, I would help you blow up our pipelines." Okay? And so it became obvious to those. Wasn't obvious to me in Baghdad. I didn't know why they were attacking their own pipeline. But Ahmed Chalabi, who was in Baghdad in September of 2003, he was appointed the head of the council there. He knew that the opening a pipeline to Israel was a non-starter. But he was under a lot of pressure from the neocons and the Israeli government to get Iraqi oil to Israel before the end of 2003. So Chalabi set up his own oil minister, a guy that came in September and took Thamar Gadban's place. And he called out in the senior marketing guy, a guy by the name of Mohammed Al-Jabari, and said, "You will start selling your oil to Glencore." And Glencore is a well-known commodities trading organization that today, it's still in existence today. In fact, they do good business today. But Glencore got its start as it was known as Mark Rich AG. Mark Rich was an extremely successful Middle East oil trader, and Mark was responsible from 1970 until 1995. He was the biggest provider of oil to Israel. Okay, and the way he did that, the way Mark did that with Mark Rich AG was he cut these deals with Iran. And Iran, through the Shah in the late 1960s, early 1970s, they supplied a steady stream of oil to Israel.
So, Gary, you're just talking about Mark Middleton and his role pre-Glencore, discussing how Israel used to get their oil from the Shah of Iran, which would have been pre-1979, before the revolution, where the Shah was an ally of Israel and the US and the UK. He was put in power in the famous 1953 coup of Mohammad Mossadegh, after he nationalized the Anglo-Persian or Anglo-Iranian oil company, which after the coup and the Shah was installed became BP, along with a few other oil companies as well. So the Shah, he wasn't too afraid to be friendly with Israel, unlike other Arab countries within the Gulf, like Saudi Arabia and others. But Mark Middleton was the man to set this up. So if you could just carry on laying out that story and Glencore, that would be great.
Yeah. Mark Rich. Mark Rich was
Mark Rich.
Mark Rich AG, and he was the key player because he made contacts in Iran, and he was able to keep the oil flow going. And Iran being Persian, they had some difficulty with the Suez Canal sometime getting their oil to their Mediterranean customers. But Mark helped them with a solution with Israel. They ran a top secret pipeline from the Red Sea side up the Gulf of Aqaba to the port of Eilat in Israel. They ran a 40-inch pipeline from there up to the Mediterranean port of Ashkelon. Yeah, Ashkelon. It's a 40-inch pipeline, can carry more than 1 million barrels a day. Israel's demand at the time was about 100,000 barrels a day, so they could get what they needed from the pipeline at a cheap price, a discounted price, because the pipeline was a joint venture between Israel and Iran. It was called EAPC, the Eilat Ashkelon Pipeline Company, and it was a 50-50 joint venture. And it stayed and worked for years that way. And then in 1979, Iran had their the Shah got deposed, and the new guys came in. Well, Mark Rich continued to do deals with these guys, and he was able to continue because all the people in the Ministry of Oil of Iran, they just wanted to sell their oil and get cash for their oil, and Mark provided that, and he could get them access to customers in the Mediterranean through the same pipeline. So they just continued that until 1994, 1990. Well, certainly in 1994 is when it stopped. Because at that point Mark got a little greedy, and he started going out and the Mark Rich AG started to get involved in other commodities besides oil. He was worth a couple $1 billion at the time, but he wanted more. So he tried to corner the zinc market, and he lost his shirt, and so he was bailed out, or the company was bailed out by some London financiers. The Rothschilds came in, spent a lot of money, and they brought in new management. They called it Glencore, and then continued on from there. But what happened was, with Mark Rich gone, with the contacts, Israel no longer got access to Iranian oil. So starting in 1995, the Glencore supplied them with oil, and then another offshoot of Mark Rich AG was Trafigura, was another one. They supplied oil, but they had to get it from the spot market. So they were paying a spot price plus probably a premium. And one of the articles that I read in Haaretz was they felt like they were paying a 25% premium for their energy, for their oil, from starting in 1995 going forward. Well, hey, a 25% premium for any country is going to be a huge economic burden on the economy. And so they needed a solution to that problem, that very serious economic problem that they had. And so in walks Ahmed Chalabi in the late 1990s, and he gave speeches in the U.S. at the Israel lobby organizations, promising them that if they'd help him overthrow Saddam, that he'd take care of this serious problem. And he did. And so in October 2003, he ordered Mohammed al-Jabouri to start selling to Glencore, and Mohammed refused. And Mohammed refused because we in CPA Oil told him that we didn't want him selling any oil to oil traders, because the risk of corruption was so much greater with these oil traders that they had been trading with during the Saddam era, that they could only sell to end users, large companies with refineries that would process the oil. And so Mohammed refused to, because he agreed with the policy. He supported the policy. He didn't want corruption in his organization. Well, he was fired. Chalabi had him fired, and they brought in a guy that started selling oil to Glencore in October 2003. And so Israel got access to Iraqi oil starting in 2003. Now, the way they'd get access was it was exported up through the pipeline in Turkey to Ceyhan, Turkey, starting then, and then it would be delivered via ship down to the port of Haifa or Ashkelon. We started these attacks on the pipeline in the north were unbelievable. We continued to get these attacks on the pipeline in the north that would shut down exports out to Ceyhan. We did not know for years after. We didn't know why that was the case. But I learned eventually that was the driver. It was because oil was being sold to Israel from Iraq, now it went on that way from 2003 until 2013. In 2013, ISIS had come into the country, shut down the northern pipeline in total. But the Kurds, the Iraqi Kurds, who are very close to Israel, they built a pipeline from Erbil over to the pipeline that went to Ceyhan, and they started supplying roughly 500,000 barrels a day, every day from 2013 on to Glencore, Trafigura, and other traders. But the Kurds had a serious problem. The Baghdad refused to cooperate with those sales, and declared that that was smuggled oil. It was 500,000 barrels a day of smuggled oil, and so the only customer that the Kurds could sell that to was Israel. When they tried to sell a couple of cargoes, one to the United States in Galveston in 2014, but the Baghdad went through their lawyers. They found a judge in Galveston that declared that this was a smuggled oil, and sent the people out to seize the cargo. Well, they were able to escape out of the Gulf of Mexico before they could be seized, and they delivered the oil to Ashkelon. It was offloaded at Ashkelon. There was another shipment just after that they tried to deliver the cargo to Canada, had a very similar problem. The ship turned off their satellite beaming system, so that no one knew where they were for a week or so, and all of a sudden the ship was empty of its cargo. But from from 2013 until a couple of years ago, Israel got highly discounted oil because the if you think about it, they were the only country that could accept the oil because Baghdad would go in and seize the oil if it went to any place else. And so Israel became an exporter of oil because they bring in so much of the Iraqi oil, and they actually changed the direction of the pipeline from Eilat to Ashkelon. Now they were offloading in Ashkelon and exporting out of Eilat, and they were making a lot of money on this import-export business of oil from 2013 until a couple of years ago. And what happened a couple of years ago was there was an arbitration hearing between Turkey and Baghdad, and the pipeline was shut down. But here's the key to all this. From 2013, for roughly 10 years, Israel got access to very, very inexpensive oil. If you look at the economy of Israel, it boomed during that time period. In fact, what I quote in my book is that in 2003 there were only 8 billionaires in Israel. In 2019, according to Haaretz, there were 128 billionaires in Israel. If you look at the United States, in 2020, we had something like 600 and some billionaires for a country of 340 million. So if you compare the number of billionaires in 2019, Israel actually had, on a per capita basis, not twice as many, not 3, but 8 times more billionaires per capita than what we had in the United States. 8 times. Okay, and I cover all that. By the way, here's my first book, Iraq and the Politics of Oil. And it was published in December of 2017. And this thing truly covers a lot more than the oil agenda. This covers what the U.S. forces did to support the oil sector. And several people had requested that I publish this book, write it and publish it. General Petraeus was one. General Dempsey was another. Some ambassadors had approached me because I'd been out there so long. So I wrote this book. It's roughly 300 pages, published by the University Press of Kansas. But then I was approached to write something smaller and more to the point, and it was just published last year. It's less than 100 pages. It's Israel, winner of the 2003 Iraq Oil War. And it truly goes into detail about various things. One of the things that it covers that I mentioned in detail is Israel recognizing that they had a very, very serious energy security issue back in 1995, and with the problems that they're having that they continue to have. So what they've done here in the last 5-6 years, starting certainly before October 7th, was their energy strategy was they've discovered a lot of natural gas wells off the coast in the Eastern Mediterranean, off the coast of Israel, off the coast of Gaza, off the coast of Lebanon. And so their plan is to develop those, which they're doing a great job on. They brought in a lot of international oil companies, and they're developing those gas fields. And their plan is to be 100% compressed natural gas and transportation by 2030, I think was their target. But if you look at those fields, they're huge, and so they're planning on actually using and then exporting a lot of natural gas to Europe. And so they're planning on putting together a sovereign fund, not unlike what Saudi Arabia or UAE or any other exporting country in the Middle East has had for decades. But one of the things that was told to me is that they had some fields that were in Lebanese waters and Israeli waters. And so they signed a treaty with Lebanon 2 years ago, I think, to how to address that. There's an extremely large, in fact, it's the largest gas field, was offshore Gaza. And it was discovered many years ago. In fact, British Gas signed a contract with the Palestinians to develop it in the 1990s, but Israel would not allow British Gas to execute that contract. And so the gas field's been sitting there. They knew it was there, but no one was allowed to develop it. And then I was told by the person that wrote the foreword for the book, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who's an extremely brilliant foreign policy person, that he shared with me that is right after October 7th in Israel, that Bibi Netanyahu seized this offshore field. And so now Bibi, they own all of that offshore, so they should be able to do quite well in the future in pursuing their strategy of becoming of taking care of energy security with natural gas.
The person you just referred to there, who did the foreword for your book, if I'm correct, he was in the George W. Bush administration. Did he work for Colin Powell? Is that correct?
Yeah. I've gotten to know Larry Wilkerson quite well over the last few years because, the way I actually got to know Larry was at first we were both on the Rachel Maddow show. Let me tell you that story. In 2014, the Rachel Maddow show, which is a very popular show here in the States, they approached me about coming on because they wanted to put together a documentary about the reason why we went to war in Iraq, and it was they claimed it was about oil, and so they approached me. I refused to go on. Then Ambassador Bremer, who was the leader of this Coalition Provisional Authority, called me up and he said, "Gary, come on, you, myself, and Megan O'Sullivan. Megan was out in Baghdad with us and was on the George W. Bush staff. She was his senior advisor for Iraq and Afghanistan in 2005 and 6 and 7, I think. But anyway, the three of us went on to argue that there was no oil agenda. Okay. And I went on, and during the interview process, I had started to read some potential oil agendas, and this one about reopening a pipeline. I just started to read about that, and so when they interviewed me, I said, "Look, there was no oil agenda, but I said there's this thing, this pipeline to Haifa." That needs to be pursued. I said, I don't have the resources to investigate that, but heck, there were 6 people sitting around asking me questions. I said, you obviously have a lot more resources available to investigate this. I think if you really want to find out something, someone needs to pursue this. But they refused to. That's not in the documentary. But anyway, Larry took the opposite view. Larry was I didn't know he was being interviewed, but then when I saw the documentary, he was the guy that was saying it was all about oil, and so that opened up a dialogue between Larry and I back in 2014 and 15 is when I wrote the book and learned a lot, and so Larry was actually arguing from a more of a high strategic level. He said his point was that if there was no oil in Iraq, we wouldn't be interested in going in and invading the country. My point was that there was no specific low-level oil agenda where there'd be a tick for tack, oil going to any oil company. But it was after that I've gotten to know Larry quite well. He was, you're right. He worked for Colin Powell when Colin was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs in in George H.W. Bush's administration. And when Colin Powell was appointed as the Secretary of State, he asked Larry to come to work for him as his chief of staff. And then after Larry left government service, he became a professor at George Washington University. And then he eventually taught at William and Mary, both very prestigious foreign policy universities in this country. And so I've kind of followed him in the last several years, and he agreed to write this forward for me. He also wrote a forward in another book written by Dennis Fritz. Dennis is a retired Air Force person who worked in the Office of Secretary of Defense, and he wrote a book the same time mine came out called it's called Deadly. Anyway, it's about Doug Feith and the neocons and their whole deceptive way of pushing for the Iraq War in 2003. And Dennis does a good job. It's called Deadly Betrayal. Deadly Betrayal is the name of the book. It was published about a year ago when mine came out.
Yeah, I think with the Iraq War, there's a lot of different interests at play from different figures, different countries. Obviously, the UK and the US. The UK role more probably going along with the US to be their kind of steadfast ally. Probably some still economic interest there, as we did discuss last time. BP did get oil from Iraq. They wasn't there for 35 years. They published on their website. They started surveying the Rumalia field in Iraq straight away in 2003. By 2009, them and PetroChina won the bid, as you described it last time, to get oil. So, different countries have different interests, although it's mainly the UK and the US. And then, you have different circles. You have the neocons, who some of them are very close to Israel. Then you have people who just kind of hated Saddam Hussein and believed it, thought they could bring democracy to the Middle East. Then you have people who thought, just more kind of regional influence in that area with military bases, or you have the arms companies. There's just lots of different interests. Obviously, what you've described here is an extraordinary story, and everything you've discussed, I will put in the show notes and up on the screen. Because I did go away before and after interview, read as many of those Haaretz articles where, in 2003, they're discussing about the potential for this pipeline, and then the US is denying it, and then Israeli figures are coming out and saying, we're speaking to the Americans to see if this could happen. You obviously discussed there as well the fact that after 1979, after the Shah was overthrown, and the current Mullah regime we have now in Iran takes over, they were still selling oil to Israel up until 1995 via Mark Rich. I realized I said Mark Middleton. He actually is a real person. He was he worked in the Clinton administration, and he was the person who introduced Jeffrey Epstein to Bill Clinton in the White House. He Not quite recently, in the last couple of years, he actually killed himself. You can look this up. It's absolutely bizarre. He killed himself. He hung himself with an electrical cord off a tree and shot himself with a shotgun at the same time.
Pretty tricky to do that, huh?
So if you look it up, he is the person where, if you see Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell in the 90s, they're in the White House with Bill Clinton. He's kind of one of the people who brought them together. He was later investigated by the US in the late 90s for some shady China stuff. I don't know, bizarre stuff, but that suicide story.
You reminded me of something, Louis. Something I failed to mention. Mark Rich, these contracts that he had with Iran while they were still supplying, it took some pretty ingenious legal work to make sure these contracts were set up and kept very secret. Well, his lawyer during that time was a guy by the name of Scooter Libby, Louis Scooter Libby, who worked for Dick Cheney. He was the chief of staff of the vice president's office during the Bush administration. And in fact, Lewis Scooter Libby, I can recall when we were doing our pre-war planning, the we put these policy papers together, saying various policy things that we were doing. And we would send them up to Doug Feith. Doug Feith would look at them, then they'd send them over. They'd be reviewed by the Deputies Committee, which was the Deputy of Defense, the Deputy of State, and then it would be pushed forward to the principals, which was the President's Cabinet, and looked at. So it was a very formal process that we used to get these policies reviewed and approved. And I remember on 2 or 3 occasions, we would get the first draft back would come back from Doug Feith, saying, "Hey, check with Scooter on this." And I remember the first time I saw that, I thought Scooter was another Pentagon classified planning group that we needed to go work with. And Mike Mobbs, who was our political appointee leader of our team, said, no, we need to call Scooter Libby at the office of the vice president and talk about this. So I sat in with Mike as we called, went on the speakerphone, and I didn't understand why we were calling some lawyer to go over these things that were pretty detailed oil things. But I was really impressed with the fact that this guy, Scooter Libby, on the other end of the phone, knew a lot about the oil industry. At the time, I had no idea that he had worked for Mark Rich for a number of years, had done a lot of work in the oil industry, in the Middle East oil industry. And Mark Rich, if you look at this, the way they kept this top secret pipeline from Eilat, Israel to Ashkelon secret from the oil industry was amazing. I worked in Saudi Arabia on in a city called Yanbu on the Red Sea side, and this pipeline was just a couple hundred miles north of where I was working, and I was sending cargoes out of gasoline and diesel through the Suez Canal. Our refinery was all the time. No idea that this crude oil pipeline in Israel existed. In fact, when I read about it in a book on a biography on Mark Rich, I contacted the guy at Mobil Oil who had traded Middle East oil for over 20 years as the Middle East oil manager, and I said, "Hey, if you were running a cargo of crude oil from the Red Sea to the Med," I said, "how would you do it?" And he said, "Well, there are only 2 ways to do that, Gary. You either run it through the Red Sea or through the Suez Canal on small ships, or you offload it and run it through the Sumed pipeline through Egypt." And I said, "No, there's a 3rd way." And he said, "No, there isn't." I said, "Yes, there is." And he said, "Well, you can run it through trucks, but no one would do that. It's too expensive." And I said, "No." I said, "There's a pipeline through," and his jaw dropped. That was the first he had ever heard of it. Now that was Mobil Oil Corporation, okay, and our Middle East oil trader for 20 years had no idea that pipeline existed, and it was truly labeled the top secret pipeline. And Scooter Libby was, like I said, he was the lawyer of Mark Rich. And Mark Rich was the guy that kept that pipeline loaded with oil for more than 20 years.
Yeah, it is an incredible story. That one alone, I mean, is incredible. That for all the rhetoric between Israel and Iran that this was going on, but then again, you have to put it in the context of not necessarily now, but the 80s with Iran-Contra, where Israel was the middleman for the US when they was tilting back and forward between Saddam Hussein and Iran in the Iran-Iraq war. When they did want to send weapons to Iran, they used Israel as a middleman, and that's where the Iran-Contra scandal comes from, where they was using the money to fund the Contras to overthrow Nicaragua because they lost permission from Congress. All this shady stuff goes on.
Yeah.
But a really interesting story. Just going to, I guess, the people you're surrounded by. We've got 10 minutes left of the interview. I appreciate, you actually have redone the story for me. As I said, it's one people just never have heard of. But since you was actually around some of these people, I'm not sure if you ever met Rumsfeld or Dick Cheney or anything like that. But with people, I guess maybe you had more contact with, like maybe Paul Wolfowitz or Doug Feith or anyone like that. What do you take as their kind of world view, their mindset? Because people always look back at these wars and they're like, what was they as evil as they seem? Like they're so conniving and conspiring, like with this pipeline or other things like arms companies, or some people go, no, they genuinely believed in it because they wanted to overthrow Iraq because they thought that would help Israel, not with the oil, but they could get rid of Saddam Hussein, put in a friendly dictator. They suggested in that policy piece in 1996. I forgot the name. It's David Wormser and Richard Pearl for Netanyahu. They said, yeah, we'll just get Jordan's king, who was a Hashemite, his cousin. He could just take over Iraq. And then that way the Shias, who are a majority, will then bow down and let Israel kind of do what they want. There's a belief that they did think like that. So what do you make of these characters? I don't know who you met more or how high up it went, but what do you make of kind of the circles you were within or what you saw?
Well, you mentioned the four-letter word evil. Evil comes to mind when I think about these guys and think about what they did and how they approached they were so deceptive in what they were doing. And in fact, this guy Mikowski that worked with me, so deceptive. They took advantage of people like me, naive people like me, who thought we were doing the patriotic thing for our country. And I gave up, like I said, 75 months of my life. And in fact, I mentioned in here the one of the feedback items I got from the first book. The first book was written in 2018. I had my 45th reunion at West Point, and I was up there talking to people, and a retired infantry colonel came up to me, classmate, and he said, "Gary, I read the book. That's quite interesting." He said, "I got one question for you." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "If you had known in 2003 what you know today, would you have volunteered to go to Iraq?" Because I was over there. I was a volunteer the entire time. Would you have volunteered to go over there for 75 months you were there? And I looked at him and I said, "Not only no, but hell no." I said, "Why would I risk my life for 75 months in a war zone on the receiving end of rockets and sometime direct fire, so that Israel could get cheap gas at the pump, or so that some neocons at the Pentagon could fill up their bank accounts? Why would I do that?" I said, "No way. No." And he looked at me and he said, "I thought that's what you'd say." But he said, "What about the soldiers?" And I said, "Exactly." I said that they didn't have a choice. They signed up thinking they were going to go fight and die for God and country, and not realizing that it was for some economic reason, or some reason for the Israel lobby to take care of Israel, to look out for the economic benefits of Israel. They didn't know that that's why they were signing up. They went over there and some of them died. Some of them didn't come back.
But
It's so,
when you actually met them at the time, though, I appreciate it's hard to not view it with all this research. You've written two books about it, but at the time of meeting them, did you feel they was unsavory characters? Did you feel, although you say he was naive and you didn't obviously see what had happened now, did they come across as just kind of regular people, or even then they just seemed a bit off? I mean, obviously the story about Paul Wolfowitz, where you was in the meeting, you all agreed that not going to blow up this pipeline with Syria or not, not affect that. And then he just did it anyway and told the general to do it. Obviously, you had that then, but at the time,
let me tell that story because that
you've only
proves
got
just how
5 minutes left. But
okay. Well, that proves how evil he was. We had already approved, the president's cabinet had approved that there would be no intentional attack on oil infrastructure. And this guy Mikowski tries to get us to change the policy, and I explained this all in the book. And we said, no, it makes no sense. And then at the 11th hour, there's a meeting called, and I'm asked to go into the meeting where Wolfowitz is there, and we go in under some other pretense that we were going to meet for this other agenda item. So we go in there, they discuss this other agenda, which we had discussed many, many times. And General Tommy Franks is on the other end along with his other, and we're sitting there. We go through that in 10 or 15 minutes, it's over. And then Wolfowitz, okay, he leans forward. I'll never forget that. Leans forward and he looks at Tommy Franks on the other end of the VTC, and he said, General, when you get into Iraq, I don't want another drop of oil to ever flow through that oil pipeline to Syria. Do you understand me? And Franks gives a salute, says, I got the mission, sir. And Wolfowitz said, meeting over, and gets out and races out of the meeting. Okay. Now he had just defied the written guidance from the president's cabinet with that order. Okay. But he didn't care. No. And a captain and 2 NCOs from the 75th Rangers died supporting that order. He didn't care. In fact, he was asked, now you got me going, he was asked in Congress in the committee how many soldiers had died in Iraq up until that point. He had no clue. No clue. Now, that oil was available to every senior person at the Pentagon every day when there was a person. He had no clue. He had no desire. He had no interest in how many soldiers had died in that war. Okay? No, evil. EVIL was what they were. Evil.
Sorry, I got you going there.
And today you look at what's going on in the Middle East, and I can't believe that my country, my Defense Department, is supporting the evil attacks that are going on in Gaza today. Hey, I just refuse to believe it. But it's happening, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, it is unfortunate. And it's interesting, I even speak to people from, like, Daniel Davis, who was involved in the Iraq War, and he was like, the way Israel conducts their war, like, I have people on, we talk about the Iraq War, Afghanistan, war crimes that happened, and it almost seems like now it's almost kind of nothing compared, like some of the examples, not the whole war and the effects on the Iraq and Afghanistan country and stuff, but the individual, like, bombing and stuff is just, it's crazy. But we've only got a little while left, but I'd like to thank you for coming on again, Gary. Appreciate it. Hopefully these recordings are all fine, unlike last time. But again, I'd recommend people to read your work, to read these articles. I'll put as much as I can in the show notes and up on the screen. And thanks again for coming on to tell this story. I do think it is very, very unknown. So it's good you've done this work, and I'll look forward to anything else you write and move on to.
Okay. Thanks for your time, Lloyd. Appreciate it.
Perfect.